Welcome to Transcendent Psych. Maybe in the past you've been like a big fan of the Matrix. What we're going to do today is explore a kind of philosophical matrix. We're going to be thinking about how we understand reality, the world in which we live, in an idealist way. That means to say that we conceive of fundamental reality as mental in nature rather than physical. Why would we want to do that, you might ask? Well, if you see some of my other videos, I'll go into that in much more detail. But basically, there's a lot of philosophers and scientists as well who are questioning whether we can make sense of all sorts of things like our conscious experience, for example, using the traditional kind of materialist version of science and philosophy. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at three really interesting philosophers. I'm going to show you three clips today. Those philosophers are Bernardo Kastrup, who is the founder of Analytic Idealism, Dr. Nathan Hawkins, who is from Cambridge, and he interlocutes, whatever the word is, with Bernardo on some interesting stuff. And also, really fascinating, a bit further on, I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Sam Lebens, who is an idealist philosopher from the Hasidic tradition. So he is a Jewish thinker and has some really interesting ideas of what happens, like the Matrix, if we imagine ourselves to be characters in a dreamed up world in the mind of God. Now, that might seem really wacky to you. It is quite wacky, but it actually throws up some really interesting questions and really interesting thought experiments, if nothing else. And bear in mind that we live in a philosophical climate these days where people are, like people like Nick Bostrom, stuff, people like that, are asking the question, do we actually live in a virtual reality? It's being taken seriously by serious thinkers. So we're going to start just by jumping into a very long conversation, just going to show you part of it, between Bernardo Kastrup and Dr. Nathan Hawkins, where they think about how we understand this reality and how we do philosophy if we're thinking about what Dr. Nathan Hawkins calls the absolute. So we're thinking here, drawing on people like Hegel, the idealist philosopher from the 19th century, I think. And how we compare that to Bernardo Kastrup's view. Kastrup sees the universe, if you like, or the reality we look out on, the physical universe, as actually really a mental reality, like a massive mind, like we calls it mind at large. And that although it appears physical to us, all those physical attributes really are things we experience, if you think about it. And the two of them in this interview converge really interestingly around this question of, well, actually, is the mind at large just a kind of blind consciousness that sort of feels its way forward? Or is it ultimately what Kastrup calls meta-conscious and kind of metacognitive as well? Is it aware that it's aware? Can it think about its thoughts? And often Kastrup says no to that, but in this interview he says, actually, if you push me and you go beyond my normal way of doing philosophy, I concede that it probably is, but from the vantage point of eternity. And that's what these two are discussing in this first clip. So let's jump in.
But if you ask me, do I think space-time is absolute? I'd say no. No, I think science is already showing, it's almost irresistible now with loop quantum gravity and new developments in foundations of physics that we will have to get rid of space-time. We will have to get rid of extension. And the only thing that truly exists is a sort of a crystal with a semantic structure that exists absolutely, meaning all at once, eternally. And that space-time is a kind of a slit with which we traverse that crystal of eternity to avoid cognitive overload. Space-time are the dimensions of the dashboard. It's the archiving system we use to organize information about the world to prevent cognitive overload. So the drawers in our filing systems are first meter, second meter, third meter, first second, second, and when we put things in those little drawers, it's our filing system. So yes, I think that is what's going on, and then everything you said is correct. Then everything that can be is by necessity, and you can now talk about absolute truths, including the absolute of the universe being metacognitive at a broad level, because we have already gone through all the play of life. And, metacognition started with these little bipedal apes, and goodness knows elsewhere in the universe how it's going. And eventually maybe the universe organizes as one big metacognitive brain of sorts. And if that can happen, then in eternity, it's already the case. So if you choose eternity as the set of states to which you apply your correspondence theory of truth, then you're absolutely right. The challenge you face, though, is that to remain consistent with this, you have to use language in an extremely precarious way. You'll basically only be able to talk metaphorically. You'll never be able to talk literally anymore, because the moment you talk, it's extension. It's an enormous challenge. And I think the way people can get there is intuitive. It's very difficult to make an argument for eternal absolute truths in the cultural discourse, because you cannot say, well, I had an experience that showed me the absolute truth. And if I said that, I wouldn't be lying. But I can't say that. It's not part of the rules of the game. And that's how religions start, right? I talk to God, you believe me. How do we do that at the cultural debate? How do we say, no, I don't require you to see that yourself. I don't require you to believe in me. I will give you an argument. The moment you say, I will give you an argument, boom, you're granting extension, you're granting space-time. And then you run into certain limitations of discourse. My own philosophy, the way I explain it to myself, is I will rather sacrifice the ultimate if, by playing the game according to the cultural and social rules of the game, I can contribute to our making a step forward. That step forward is not the ultimate reality. And if you think about it, apes are not in the business of ultimate reality. Well, what can apes access from the ultimate reality? From that perspective, I think you're right. It's just that to play the game, I cannot avoid conceding extension. Otherwise, I cannot weave an argument.
Okay, we'll stop sharing that. Basically, I think what they're saying is that if you think of mind at large, or consciousness, if it's the source of all reality within which we sit, it's far beyond our comprehension. As Kastrup talks about, we're just like these monkeys sitting on a planet, looking out, trying to make sense of it. The problem is we're trying to talk about something that goes outside of our space-time story. But our language and our thinking is evolved and grounded within the space-time reality. So it's really difficult to put it into words and therefore to make arguments about these things. I mean, for example, you just try having discussions in philosophy about time. It's really difficult. Or talking about things that are beyond time. You immediately fall into the language of before and after, and from the point of view of time, what's the relationship of time to the present or to the past or the future. It's really difficult and it's really complicated. You fall back into this reality's language to talk about a reality that transcends this experience. Okay, we're stuck in experience in a sense. So it's also really interesting there thinking about how Kastrup talks about how science itself is pointing beyond our space-time reality. So you can watch videos with him and Dr. Don Hoffman from UCL Irvine in the States, discussing, how the thinking in physics, cutting-edge physics, is that space-time is doomed. Is the language that they use. So there we are. There we have this sort of thinking going on around how we might even start to think about the absolute. And Bernardo's very happy to say, yes, I think that's true. I think there is this reality, this mind that goes beyond our current perceptions of reality, but it's really hard to talk about. Now, what we're going to do next is start to introduce you to Dr. Sam Lebens, who comes at this from a different angle, but he's talking in some senses about the same thing. So he uses the metaphor of storytelling, and he's asking the question with Robert Kuhn from Closer to Truth, asking the question of what the relationship would be, if you like, between the created world and the mind behind the created world in which we live. Call that God. In his point of view, he would speak of that as God, but you can call it source, ultimate mind, whatever you particularly want to do. And the question that comes out, partly the question that Sam Lebens is trying to deal with is, how would a mind such as God or ultimate mind, how would it create, like the traditional Jewish thinking and he's a Jew, and I think this sort of makes sense, is you can't, if you're an ultimate mind, create from something outside of you, because there is no outside of you. You are it. But also there's a problem in terms of, like, if let's say, for example, if you have a perfect mind or ultimate mind, let's just run with that for a minute, whether you think that or not. How do you create something worth creating? We're not going to make something that's better than you, but if you make something that's equal to you, then how would you know the difference between the creation and you? It would just be you, because something that's equal to you and all its properties is going to be just you. It's going to be God, the ultimate mind. If you create something less than you, well, where would be the sort of what would be the point, and what would be the justification in doing that? So that's a question that comes up in sort of atheist and theist debate sometimes. And what Sam Lebens wants to do is he comes up with an alternative solution, drawing on the idea of storytelling within the mind of God. So we're going to head over to him now and watch in this next clip. Before I show you that, though, let me just ask you if you've not subscribed yet, because I've got a lot of people that watch the channel. Some of them are doing okay. I'm a fairly small channel, but you know, some of the best videos we've done have gone up to like 8,000 what have you views, but not everybody that watches those subscribes. That could be for all sorts of reasons. Actually, I didn't like this stuff, who knows what. But I'm sure there are some people that watch the videos that do enjoy the content, but maybe don't think to subscribe. So just ask you to press that subscribe button. It does help us to grow the channel, and also gives you access to content as soon as it's available. So press subscribe now before you forget, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you so much. Let's get on with the clip.
So how can I have my cake and eat it here? How can God be wholly a person and wholly not a person? Well, it goes back to something I said earlier, which is that on a Kabbalistic conception of creation, we have to distinguish between how God is in and of himself and how God appears in this thing that we call reality. Because actually what we call reality is, on my view, I mean, there are different Kabbalistic ways of cashing this out, but on my view, what God did, because he couldn't actually create a world outside his mind, is he created an illusion. And the illusion was that there exists a world outside of God's mind. But actually, the world and all of the things in it are in God's mind. We're just characters in a story that God's telling. And the distinction we need to draw is the distinction between God as he appears as a character in his own story, and God as he really is, beyond the story. Now, those two people are numerically one. There's only one person, just like there's only one Kurt Vonnegut, even though Kurt Vonnegut appears in some of his stories, and the things that happen to him in his stories don't necessarily reflect what happened to him in real life. Likewise, I think that God is a person in the story called history. We meet him as a person, And his personality, his personhood is as real, Robert, as you and me. Because, what reality is for you and me is whatever's true in the story that God's telling. And in the story that God's telling, God is a person. But God gives us a glimpse of how he is beyond the story. And beyond the story, he's not personal. There are various things that persons can do or do that God outside of the story doesn't do or can't do. One such thing is to have relationships with other persons, because actually he's all alone.
Okay, this is a very deep investigation. I could argue that if you have personhood characteristics, then by the definition, you are a person. You may have other things, but once you have those kinds of personhood features, then you are a person, even if you have more than that.
Well, let's say that I write a story about me, okay, and in the story, I have a horn on my head, right? Now I know, and many anti-Semites used to believe that Jews had horns on their heads, but so perhaps it wasn't the best example. But just because it's true in the story that Sam Lebens has a horn on his head doesn't mean that it's true that Sam Lebens.
But that argument assumes that the person in the story is an illusion.
Well, I don't like to think of it like that. I think of it as a story sets up a domain of discourse. We can talk about a story, okay? So let's call that a domain of discourse. And then we can talk about what's true relative to the story and what's true outside of the story. It's true relative to the story that Hamlet was a prince of Denmark. It's not true outside of the story that Hamlet was a prince of Denmark. There was no such prince. Likewise, it can be true relative to a story that Sam has a horn on his head.
Oh, I agree with that. But the story is not the reality.
Well, so I think in terms of degrees of reality.
Oh.
You and I, Robert, we're not as real as God. And if the criticism is that my philosophy doesn't put ourselves on the same ontological footing as God, I actually think theists should just bite that bullet. That's part of what theism says.
Sure.
So Hamlet is less real than Shakespeare. Shakespeare is more real than Hamlet. And God is more real than Shakespeare. Stories within stories. But the ultimate author is God.
Yeah, I think that's coherent. But I think if talking about God is a person and the only instantiation of that is in God's own story,
yeah,
I'm a little uncomfortable with of attributing personhood to God because he put it into his own story.
Good. I think the discomfort comes for the following reasons. We're standing on one level of reality and we're trying to talk about, like goldfish in a bowl, trying to talk about what's outside. And I think that the following thing might help. To you and me, Robert, if it's true that we are, so to speak, fictional characters in the story that God tells, then actually on a day-to-day basis, what's most important to us is what's true in the story. Who cares if it's raining outside of the story? I want to know if it's raining where I am, right? As I say in one of my papers, Baker Street didn't actually have 221 houses in the time when Arthur Conan Doyle was writing the Sherlock Holmes stories. So should Sherlock Holmes be worried that his house doesn't exist because there's not 221 houses on Baker? No, because in the story it's true, and that's all that should matter to him.
Yeah.
Okay, really interesting there. So this idea, similar, notice the similarity to Kastrup and Hawkins' conversation about having levels of reality, and that we're talking, if we are characters in a story, we're talking about us being a subset of reality. So that Hamlet, as Sam Lebens points out, Hamlet is not as real as Shakespeare. Shakespeare is not as real as God. Okay, so we've got minds within minds within minds, which is really interesting. You can explore that. Could it be possible that the ultimate mind exists, and that here I am? Remember, we're within an idealist philosophy where everything's ultimately mental. There is the ultimate mind. Here I am as what Kastrup would call a dissociated alter, a kind of a distinct mind within the overall mind, not that we're separate, but that we're a distinct mind within the mind. And then as I write stories, which I do, or I have dreams, or I have my daydream, what have you, I'm thinking of other characters, you know, could they have a reality of their own? And, you know, we can get into other questions around what those characters would, what their properties would be. Would they have free agency? Yada, yada, yada. We'll explore that in a second. But this really fascinating idea that we've got levels of reality. And if you think back, of course, to, you know, ideas like Neoplatonism, you're coming into that again. You've got ideas of like, well, this current world, think of Plato's allegory of the cave. This current world is just really like people looking at the wall of the cave, seeing mere shadows projected by the firelight behind them onto the wall. And then one person escapes the cave and looks out and sees the bright sunshine and is like, wow, you know, if that person goes back into the cave and tries to tell the others in the cave, come outside because there's another, that's what's really real. This is just a shadow. You know, that's what Plato thinks of reality as like, you know. So this is not a completely novel or crazy idea. This is something that's been thought for a long time by a lot of very serious philosophers. I mean, Plato's pretty serious, right? You know, was it Alfred North Whitehead said that philosophy is, but the rest of philosophy is a mere footnote on Plato, right? So I think it's a really useful and intriguing and interesting point of view. And we could add into that, just as a sidebar, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too much, but we could also bring in the experiences people talk about when they have near-death experiences, or maybe even when they have, not that I'm advocating this, but, you know, psychedelic trips. People have experiences where they describe the level of reality they experience when they exit this level of reality is more real than real. So there's potentially, I don't want to make a strong argument on this necessarily on this front, but there's potentially empirical evidence people can experience to back this up as a theory, at least at the level of multiple realities, whether or not we say we're characters or not in the mind of God. What I want to do for a while, we're going to come back to Kastrup and Hawkins shortly, but I want to explore the ramifications of this matrix-like idea that maybe we are fictional characters within the mind of ultimate mind or God or source, whatever you want to call this. Okay. So we've already talked about this idea that would mean that we are kind of sub-realities and living in a sub-reality. Interesting, Lebens and Kuhn there get into this back and forth around, well, you know, does that mean we're fictions? And if God is, let's say, as Lebens wants to argue, entering into human history as a Jewish believer, he's going to think that, you know, Christians would also think this in the character and person of Christ. You know, if God enters into history, are we and God entering into that history, are they fictions then? Well, Lebens wants to say, no, not from within the actual story, not within the reality, the lived reality we are experiencing. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to care about whether, you know, in ultimate reality, if the picture is somewhat different, I'm still living this reality, still experiencing this reality. So it's real. It's not that it's not real. It's levels of reality, is what he's saying, and that happens, of course, in fictions. It happens in dreams, and the argument is that that's what's going on in life itself. This also raises interesting questions, if this were true, around freedom, human freedom. Okay, so do we then have free will? If we are characters in God's story, do we have free will? I mean, authors, when they write stories, are just the imaginings and this scripting of what the author writes. Even actors in films, they might have some latitude of freedom in how they act out that character that's on the script. and the director will have some say in it, right? But it's pretty much a scripted thing. So is that what it's like? Should we be determinists if we subscribe to this idea that we are kind of fictitious characters within the mind of God? Well, you could argue that the absolute, as Nathan Hawkins would argue or call this, the overmind, the ultimate mind, you could argue that this overmind, as an author, is able to give degrees of freedom to the characters in the story or in the dreamed up reality. Okay, so it might not be exactly analogous to, say, Shakespeare writing about Hamlet as Prince of Denmark. In that scenario, Hamlet has no degrees of freedom. He just does what Shakespeare wants him to do. But it's not inconceivable that a divine author could create characters within constraints, let's say, because you have personality. There are the laws of physics, if you like, or the laws in your story of how the world works, but it's conceivable that you can create characters that have degrees of freedom, and that perhaps the story, I don't know if some of you are as old as me, but if you remember when I was growing up, there were stories they would call, what was it, create your own adventure story. So you could kind of get to page 31 and your character's given a choice. Do you want to do this, in which case turn to page 45, or do you want to do this, in which case jump to page 54 or whatever, but take that up a level. If you've got a divine mind that is able to dream up all sorts of things, is it able to create worlds that have a latitude or degree of autonomy, okay, or freedom, that the author is able to borrow again from Sam Haben's a kind of Hasidic view, that God somehow, that mind contracts itself and pulls out from a space within the divine mind to allow a world with some degree of freedom. So in Kabbalah and Hasidic Judaism, that's referred to as tzimtzum, the idea that God retreats from a space and leaves a void into which he then injects the divine presence, but in a way where you can have a reality, but a reality that has some freedom and is not exactly the same as the divine, although it ultimately is of and one with the divine. Anyway, that's another rabbit hole, perhaps. Another issue that comes up with this kind of stuff is the issue of identity. Okay, so while we would not be God within the story, we would remain aspects of God in the story because the author is generating the characters. Okay, but then we might want to ask, what does that mean? How should we then live if this were the case? We might want to argue, for example, that we as characters, perhaps and especially if we have degrees of freedom and are co-authoring the story, we have some obligation to help the story to unfold in the best way that it possibly could. Now, that's a whole other set of questions we might come to in a minute around what that would depend on what the purpose of the story was, right? Or if there were any purpose to the story. We'd also have to remember, I guess, that we and the other characters in the story are actually, in reality, from the viewpoint of the author, from the viewpoint of the absolute, we're all one. So there might be an appearance of lots of different characters, but actually we're all the imagining and the outworking of this one mind. All that really exists at the ultimate level of reality is this one mind. The sub-reality, of course, is always dependent on, contingent upon that mind. Like a bauble hanging off a Christmas tree. Take the Christmas tree away and the bauble falls. In this scenario, though, take the divine mind away, or source, whatever you want to call it, away, we disappear instantly. Okay, so there's questions there of identity. I've touched on this already. This now leads us to the question of what the author's purpose could, if any, be. So why might the absolute be writing or creating this story? What is the story being written? Maybe there are many stories. I mean, if we look at the world, there are many lives going on, but there might be other worlds, other universes that this this mind is generating. There could be an infinite number of stories, films, dreams playing out in the mind of God. And perhaps a question we could ask is this playing out a kind of playing out of all the possible stories or all the possible roles that the absolute could play? I mean, this is entirely speculation, right? But, is the divine mind kind of playing out all these different roles and lives? So when you look at me playing out my life and think about you playing out your life, are we actually the absolute in an aspect of the absolute in the story, in the dream, playing out like a VR headset, playing out a version of reality? And that sort of raises a further question. So when Kastrup and Hawkins talked about this, right? So from the viewpoint, we're stuck within the space-time experience, and we can only think about it using space-time language of extension. But from the viewpoint of eternity, from the viewpoint of the absolute, that story and all possible stories potentially are already known. So in which case, then that raises another question, like, why would you write a story where you already know the outcome and everything that happens? Well, I mean, is that too impossible? Authors, presumably, when they write stories, they might have a rough idea of where the story is going. Not that I want to make a complete analogy between this and the divine mind, but play with me. You might have a rough idea of the plot and where the story is going, or if not, the kind of characters, and you want to see how the characters play out and what sort of plot generates out of these characters. Or you could potentially, let's say, a divine mind could enter into a story in a way that we might watch a film or enter into a virtual reality, that we kind of, in a sense, forget ourselves. That maybe the divine mind, in a sense, although from the vantage point of eternity knows all the stories, when it enters into the fiction and into the story, into the space-time reality, it forgets itself and takes on these kind of virtual reality roles. And in that sense, that could very well be, in a sense, what I am doing right now. Here I am in my virtual reality making a video about whether I am just this and whether there's something else that we're all part of that's going on. Oops, we remembered. Oh, maybe not. Okay, so some interesting, highly speculative thoughts there that I think are actually really quite interesting nonetheless. So, I mean, I guess another thing to add on to that is that even if we don't forget completely who we are, we know the experience. When we watch a film, even if we've seen that film before, even if, so from one point of view, I know the film, I know the entirety of the story and space-time history already, I might be able to both know it from that point of view. I've watched the film before, but I can still get back into the film and enjoy it again and forget, in a sense, and put it on hold that I've watched the film before, right? There's something I enjoy the experience of the movie. I've watched Apollo 13, one of my favorite films, multiple times, Saving Private Ryan. And maybe it's a Tom Hanks thing, who knows? But yeah, I can't remember who it was, whether it was C.S. Lewis or someone else that said, maybe God is like a being who, can see a sunset and see a sunset again and see it again and just experiences that joy every time again, like a small child might do. Small child, like, again, daddy, again, 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 you know, who knows? This is entirely speculative, but, you know, multiple experiences, knowing what's going to happen doesn't necessarily reduce the enjoyment in it. But again, it may be the purpose of doing this is nothing to do with enjoyment. Who knows? None of these particular speculations around why the absolute author, if this is what's going on, is doing this, none of them have to be particularly true. It's we're literally playing around with possibilities. And if we go back to Kastrup and Hawkins again, chances are we're probably not going to understand what ultimate mind is up to. And in a sense, as Lebens points out, it doesn't matter at a certain level, because I guess, and this is worth pointing out, if this is true, I mean, you don't want to watch a film and sit there and go, yes, but ultimately, although I'm watching this film like Apollo 13 and I kind of know how it ends, that's the thing that I really need to keep into my mind, that it's just a film as I'm watching this film. None of us do that. We know at A level that this is just a film. It's not reality. It's part of the pleasure. But we still nevertheless enjoy watching the film. None of us watch a film and so tell ourselves, well, it's just a fiction. There's no, well, in Apollo 13's case, it's not fiction, but, you know, let's say we watch a fiction. None of us do that and think, what's the point of doing this? You know? So I'll park that there, something for you to cogitate more on. Lebens refers to the writer Kurt Vonnegut, who enters into his own stories. Now, that's an interesting question, because certainly Lebens, as a Jewish philosopher and a rabbi, believes that the divine enters into human history. Christians think, like in the character of Jesus, the incarnation, that God has entered into human history. In Vonnegut's movie in his novel, he enters into the story and says to some of the characters there, I was always there watching you, the hidden in the darkness in the cocktail bar. Now, you know, the characters normally in a film are, well, pretty much always in a film, never break that fourth wall and kind of say, you know, hi director, hi author, or hi guys, you know, this is just a film. This is just a film or just a story. But you can create stories where the fourth wall is broken. And in a sense, we could perhaps think of ourselves, even right now, doing this video of us. We are, in a sense, potentially breaking the fourth wall and saying, hi, absolute. In a way, here we are. We're thinking about what's going on at quite a meta level. That idea of the incarnation is interesting as well, because if you think about it, in Vonnegut's novels, he enters into the story, but all the characters are a kind of incarnation of Vonnegut. They came out of his mind. It's impossible for an author to take themselves out of the story, because it's always some aspect of yourself being expressed in the characters. Some opinion you've got, some perspective you've got on what it would be like to be, but you're never completely out of the perspective of the story. Right? You're implicit in the story. And that's an interesting thought as well, that we could think of ourselves, when we think about ourselves, we think about reality. Is the divine always sort of implicit in the story, in this reality? And you could say, yeah, I mean, reality is contingent, or our reality is contingent on whatever the source of all this reality is. And so the source of the cause of everything, in a sense, is always implicit in the sub-reality. I'll leave that with you. Let me move on to final area of consideration, and then we're going to come on to the clip with Kastrup and Hawkins in this. And that is what philosophers call the problem of evil. So in classic theism, you can frame it like this. If you have a divine mind, an ultimate, but you also have a world like ours in which we live, in which there's suffering, the classic problem of evil sort of says, well, how can it be justified for a good author, if you like, a good creator, source of all? If it's good, why would it create a world in which characters live and suffer? Surely that's unnecessary. And there are all sorts of what are called theodicies and so forth that are attempts to try to explain or get the author off the hook. And some of them are better than others. You know, you've got the kind of this world being a veil of soul making, or you've got issues around sort of free will, that God has to allow a certain degree of suffering for us to be able to make moral choices, that evil has to be a possibility. There are all sorts of things. There are problems with almost all of them, and interesting things I have to say as well, each of them. But I think when we take Sam Lebens' view, this introduces a novel factor. If everything is mind, and if we are all actually aspects within the mind of God, the only reality that really exists is the divine mind. I'm going to not say more about that for a moment, and I'm going to come to Dr. Nathan Hawkins and Dr. Bernardo Kastrup as they think this through.
There's another point where you seem to want to not offer metacognition to mind at large because it ties you into something to do with the problem of evil. That it would mean that there's a video of it. I haven't read it in your books, but there's a video where you talk about this.
There is not a motivation to deny metacognition from mind at large. I think I'm sufficiently committed to truth that I'll bite the bullet.
I'll just jump in here just quickly and say, so they're talking about metacognition because they're saying, like, if the ultimate author, if you like, or mind at large, the absolute, the source, the ultimate mind, if it is metacognitive, so that means it's aware of its own thinking, it's aware, the author is aware of creating this particular world in the way it is, then that would make the author culpable, in a sense. It knows that it's actually producing a world like this, and that would need justifying. So I just want to give that context to where they're coming at this from.
Whatever the implications are, that we don't like the implications of something is not a reason to not pursue that line of thinking if the evidence and the reasoning point in that direction. But since I reason my way to that in another way anyway, it helps me understand the problem of evil. So I denied metacognition from mind at large on completely different grounds.
Okay.
But once it is denied, I don't run into the problem of evil.
But here's why I don't think you run into it anyway. Because, all right, so the problem of evil seems to be something like this. If we think about the kind of suffering we have, and if we have a God that has the omniscience and the power and can look down and see and recognize evil going on and yet doesn't do anything about it, how mean, how cruel. But if you have analytic idealism as your metaphysics, then the only one suffering here is mind at large. We might be we're dissociated alters of mind at large, but we are a doing of mind at large. So in some ways, it's a bit like, well, if I have a dream and my dream avatar undergoes something horrific, it's not like I'm sadistic. Or similarly, if I had a dissociated, I'm not. So in some ways, I thought what analytic idealism gives you is a little bit more like something along the lines of the sort of the Christian notion of suffering, in that God comes down and suffers with us, because of us, and through us, and somehow that God partakes in that suffering. And so then the problem of evil, I think, is far less of a problem. I mean, and I realize it's not part of your philosophy, you have independent reasons for it. But
no, I'm happy to comment on this. In the previous answer, by the way, I said 150 years. I meant 250 years, of course. Never mind. I understand the rationale. Whatever suffering is being posed by God is God doing it to himself or herself or itself.
So, yeah, it is interesting, right? I was having this discussion with my mate Jono down the pub the other week, and I put this. I knew I was going to do this video, and I sort of wanted to run this argument past him in a sense and say, well, actually, does this make a difference to the problem of evil if everything ultimately is the divine mind, is the ultimate source and mentation of mind, and we're working within the mind of God? The only being that exists, the only reality of being that really exists, is the divine. We are really dream figures within the mind of God. The only reality exists is God's. So my consciousness, your consciousness, everything that's made out of mind, if you like, is God's mind. And so the accusation that God is doing wrong is it changes. So Kastrup kind of talks about that at the end of the only way, the only problem that you might still face is, well, why would God be doing this to itself? I guess let's explore that briefly. If you had Kurt Vonnegut entering into his own story, and his characters, of course, remember, are part of himself, but he also enters more directly into the story as himself. This is only analogous. It only works by analogy in a sense, because the divine mind wouldn't be a limited author in the same way that Vonnegut is, right? But entering into the story, if he made himself suffer, is that a problem? Well, you could argue, is he doing evil to himself? Well, not really, because from his point of view, the story is still a fiction. It's a story. I can sit here right now and entertain the idea of what it would be like if I were to chop my own leg off. Right? I'm actually not doing myself any harm. Right? Outside of that imaginary scenario that I just painted in my head, my leg's still there. And this is all, again, we're talking about time and space language to talk about something that is beyond space and time when we're thinking about a divine mind. But I think it's an important and useful point to make, that actually, in a sense, the evil that happens in the world, and this is a classic way out of the problem of evil in the past that many people have been a bit reticent to take, is to deny the reality of the world, to deny the real reality of the cosmos, that it's a sub-reality, that the really real is the divine mind, and that therefore there is no evil. Of course, that might then throw up problems like, well, what happens then to the good that happens in the world? Is that also fictitious? Well, from the point of view of outside the story in the mind of God, yes. But the author might still enjoy having the story, watching the film, watching Saving Private Ryan, or what have you. Anyhow, I've painted all sorts. We could go on for hours on this. I might do other videos because it is a really interesting and I think a worthwhile, although it's highly speculative, a worthwhile kind of thought experiment. So I'd love to know, what do you think? What particular issues do you think? What does Sam Lebens' view here, Kastrup's view, Hawkins' view, what do they add to the discussion? What does it change in the way we understand reality, in the way we understand our lives, in the way we think about the value and the meaning of our lives, excuse me, if this model were correct? Again, please do subscribe if you've not subscribed yet, because it does help on the old algorithm, gives you instant access to any of these videos. And do please give it a like, tickle the algorithm with a little tickly like, and also share wherever you share videos. Put a comment in there. Love to know what you think. Got further questions, argue it out, argue it amongst yourselves, argue with me, I don't care, it's great, it's all a fiction anyway. Take care, guys, and if you're watching this at Christmas and around the New Year, happy Christmas, happy New Year. If you're watching this in the future, that's a future that is not yet written, but I hope it goes well for all of us. But at the end of the day, it's not really real. Take care, guys. See you next time. Bye.